Hello. Now we are going to look at several ways of turning the bramble plant into rope or cordage. So brambles are where we get our blackberries from in autumn. To identify it, it's our thorny, so there are thorns all the way along our stem and along the branches here. So it's a thorny plant that grows through our hedgerows or sometimes grows through waste ground, unattended ground. The leaves are going to grow out in bunches on the ends of stalks. So we have one leaf coming out at the end, and then we have leaves coming in pairs, usually 5 of them in total, going around like that. And it will be bright green when it is young, and if it's out in the sunlight it will tend to turn purple over time as it gets older and is out in the sun, and it will tend to get shinier over time as well. And when it gets much older, when there are stems that are several years old, it will get a little bit woody in texture and can look a little bit more like rose. But this is what you will see for our first year growth of bramble. Now, depending on how old the bramble is and depending on the time of year, we would use different methods to turn it into different types of rope. So when we are working with bramble, we are going to want to have either have leather gloves on, not normal gardening gloves, because the thorns can go through and end up hurting our hands when we don't expect it. So we can use leather gardening gloves or strong gardening gloves. Or if we don't have enough of them for everyone we're working with, we can cut up old pieces of heavy cloth. This is an old piece of denim trousers, and that will work well to protect people's hands. And we will also need to use cutting tools, either secateurs, heavy scissors, or our knives. And wherever we're going to use tools of any kind, we're going to make sure we have our first aid kit out and with us. We'll have our trained first aider whose training is in date and everybody knows who that first aider is. And before we take out our tools, we would check that our blood circle is clear. The area and arm span around and behind us is completely clear of anyone. And then we could take out our tools. And now we're going to look at several ways that we could turn bramble into cordage. When we want to make brambles into cordage, what we're looking for is to have as few side branches as possible, and ideally that the bramble stays at roughly consistent thickness along the area that we are working. And the best place to look for that is often in hedgerows. So this bramble here stays at about pencil thickness for 4 or 5 meters. It rises up through the hedge and then drops back down again, and when it's doing that it has very little access to light, so it doesn't tend to side branch quite so much. So this is the ideal place to look, but hedges can often be close to ditches or they can be close to roadways, and it's important that we know who the landowner is so that we have permission to gather materials from there. So just be sure that the area is safe and that we have permission to use the resources. But this is the ideal place to go looking for bramble for cordage. We can also find it anywhere that bramble is growing, but often in more open areas the bramble will grow into itself and be more difficult to get out, and it will often have more side branches if it's in the sun more. If we want to make fine cordage out of bramble, we can only really do it in late spring. So if we wanted to end up with nice fine fibers like this that we could twist up into normal rope, the only time of year that we can do it is pretty much in May or very early June. What we're looking for is first year growth of bramble. So this is all bright green. It hasn't gotten old or woody at all yet. This is in its first year of growth, and the needles on it, the thorns on it, are still soft. So I'm not wearing gloves and I can push my hands into the thorns and they are soft to the touch. They haven't gone wooden, they haven't gone hard yet. That's how I know that this method is going to work. And if the bramble is young like this and its thorns haven't gotten totally hardened yet, then what we can often do is scrape the outer layer of bark off and then get down to the fibers that we want for making fine cordage. And that's what we're going to look at in detail now. So what I'm going to do is scrape off this outer layer of bark. There's a few ways that I can do that. The first one, which wouldn't involve using a cutting tool for most of it, is to take a stick, hold onto the end and whack the side branches off. Particularly when they're young like this, a quick flick of the wrist will knock the side branches off. You can also run it down and make sure that any of the harder thorns are cleared off as well. But now we want to get rid of this glossy layer of material that we can see on top. So we need to now scrape that off. And what we can do is break off the very green end of this, because it won't have enough fibre to be very useful to us. And then we could take a drinks bottle that has a hole drilled in the top of it, and we could sit that down on top of our bramble, and we can run it back and forth, and it can scrape that outer layer off. You can see that outer layer is just sliding off on this very young bramble, and the layer underneath, the almost see-through fibres, are what we want for making cordage. Now, if we don't have our plastic bottle, we can also use the back of our knife, but then we need to make sure that we have our first aid kit out and with us, and we might want to wear some gloves. So if we put on gloves, if we wanted to scrape that off with the back of our knife, check the blood circle. So it checks the blood circle, and our first aid kit is out with us. We'll be able to have the cutting edge facing away from us. We'll be able to scrape off our material in the same way, and that will get us down to that clear fibre that we want for making our fine cordage. When we have scraped off our outer bark, we will get a much brighter green colour, and we'll be able to see a little bit of lines to it, because it'll be able to look at the fibres. This darker material here is what we are looking at as the outer skin, so we can scrape that away in late spring, and then we're able to get down to the fibres. If I come up to here where I've fully scraped away the fibres, when I bend that stalk, it separates out, and then I get to these very soft, very easy to work fibres. And I'd let them dry, and then I'd re-wet them just a very little bit, and then I'd be able to twist them up into fine cordage. Here we have two older pieces of bramble. This is 1 year old, so this is what we might see from a year's growth, say in winter time. And here we have a piece of bramble that would be maybe 2 or 3 years old. So that's the types that we're looking for. The thorns on these are totally different. So these are very fine hair-like thorns that we can possibly barely even see on the video. And these almost look like rose thorns. So we can get a huge variety of thorns in our brambles, but we can still use them for broadly the same purpose. This we could turn into fishhooks, whereas this we could not. But from a cordage point of view, our 1 year growth brambles can be stripped down to make stitching type material, and our heavier, older growth that has gone very woody can be twisted up into withies. We can strip the thorns from our brambles by using an old drinks bottle with a hole in the top of it. And what we can do to begin with is hold the bramble tight. So we leave it attached to the ground, hold the bramble tight, sit the bottle over it with the handle part of it up the bramble, and then scrape off the early thorns. Then we can flip the bottle around, because it's easier to hold the other way around, and then we can clear the rest of the thorns on the bramble. And this allows us to clear a lot of thorns very quickly, much faster than we could with the back of our knives. To turn last year's growth of bramble, so 1 year old bramble, into stitching material, we would have to gather it in winter when the fibre is stuck to the woody layer very firmly. And what we are going to do is split it into 2 pieces, and then we are going to scrape out the white pith that we can see in the middle of our bramble. So I have the thorns removed from this piece, and I want to put a split in it, so I'm going to use my knife. So I have my first aid kit out, and I'm going to check my blood circle. And now I can take out my knife. And I don't want it hold onto the knife like this. What I want to do is try and put the butt of the knife, the bottom of the knife, down into my palm so that it can't slip when I push. So I hold my fingers out straight and tilt my wrist back, and then the butt of the knife can sit down into the palm of my hand. And now that can't slip as I push. I hold the tip of the knife with the cutting edge facing away from me, to the middle of my bramble. It's important this split goes down through the middle. Then I press down onto a wooden anvil, and I make sure that split is nicely opened up. And now the knife is not in use. It instantly goes back in its sheath. to continue this split, what I need to do is make a very thin wooden knife for doing my splitting. So this is very, very thin in order to split the bramble effectively, and I can use the knee grip very well to thin down the two sides of a little branch in order to make my splitting knife. To split my bramble, I'm going to hold my hands together. I'm going to take my thin wooden splitting knife and I'm going to sit it down into the split that I have already created. Now I have a wedge shape to my splitting knife, but I don't want to press that wedge down into the bramble. What I want to do is waggle the bramble back and forth to open up that split. But as I do that, I can see that this top side of my bramble is thinner. It's bending out of the way. And with bramble, I need to catch a thinness like that very quickly, or the bramble will just tear out to one side. If I had spruce root, it might be a little bit more forgiving, but with bramble, I need to catch this immediately. So how I'm going to bring the split back to the center of my bramble is I am going to twist my wooden knife down. The back end of my knife is going to go down, and that's going to bend the thicker side more. That's going to tend to tear some of the fibers out of the thicker side and bring the split down, or bring the split back toward the middle of the bramble. Now I don't want to overdo that. I can send the split too far this way. So once I think it's a little bit back toward the middle, I'm going to start waggling the knife around, back and forth, and that's going to ease the bramble apart, keeping my hands together as I'm splitting so that I don't push the knife in. I'm letting it split by twisting back and forth, and I keep going down the length of the bramble. When I've split my bramble into two equal pieces, my next job is to scrape out the pith. So what I want to do is put the bramble down on my knee, but I'm going to put a piece of heavy fabric, a piece of leather or denim, or in this case a glove, down on my knee, and I'm going to put the foamy part, the pith part of the bramble facing up. Now I need my knife, so I'm going to check my blood circle is clear, and I have my first aid kit out with me. My blood circle is clear, so I can take out my knife. I want to press the knife down onto my knee, but I obviously don't want to press the cutting edge down into my knee. So what I'm going to use is the back of my knife, and I'm going to have the cutting edge facing away from me so I'm as safe as possible. I could also use a kitchen knife, something with a secondary bevel for this purpose, but I'm going to press the spine of the knife, the back of the knife, down onto my piece of fabric, down onto my knee, and then I'm going to pull the bramble back across my knee. So the knife stays still, and it is the spine of the knife that goes down onto the bramble, down pressed against my knee, and in that way I can scrape out this foamy stuff quite safely, and I do that for the entire length of my bramble. When I have scraped all of the pith out of my piece of bramble, what I'm going to do is wrap it up into a neat coil for storing it so that I can use it later. So what I'm going to do is leave a tail sticking out. I'm going to wrap it around my hand, and then when I have a bit of a tail left, I'm going to wrap that tail around one way, and then take the tail that I started with and wrap it the other way. And that forms a very stable coil that I can store for as long as I need to, and then rehydrate whenever I want to use it for cordage. Where we have bramble that is 2 or 3 years old and has gone quite woody, we can twist it up into a withy in the same way as we would turn a branch into a withy or into cordage. So what I've done here is take the thorns off of this bramble in the same way as we had before, and this works best when the bramble isn't actively growing. It'll work any time of year once you have woody bramble, but it's best when we are in late summer into winter. But all we do is start to twist up the bramble, same way as we would with a withy. So we start at the end and we start to twist the fibers, and they'll feel quite stiff to begin with, and then at a certain point they'll give way. You might have heard that little pop there as it gave way, and now this bit is much more flexible, so I can bend that a little and use it as a handle to get the rest of it twisting more easily. Now the only difference between withying a woody bramble, an old bramble, and withying a branch is the angle we can bend at. If this was a branch, I could get away with kinking this over quite extremely like that. But if I do that with a bramble, until it's twisted, the pith is quite rigid and it will tend to crack on us. So the only difference between this and twisting up a wooden withy is that we want to keep the angle more gradual. Now fortunately, a bramble is less stiff overall, so it's easier to twist than a wooden withy is, but we just need to keep this angle a little bit more gradual. As I'm twisting, as I'm pedaling this down like I would with a normal withy, I would keep my angle a little bit more gradual, less kinked over than I would with a wooden withy. But other than that, it is the same. And those are some ways that we can turn the bramble plant into cordage, and that is what we need for now.